Hi, I'm Pete Fisher, Chief of Police for the City of Fife, and this is Chat with the Chief, a video series dedicated to answering questions or discussing topics that are important to our community. This month's episode is the State of the Police Department. Each year, I cover the annual report with our City Council. Please join me as we look back on 2022. Thank you, Mayor, members of council. As you're aware, every year we do the State of the PD presentation, and that covers the critical areas of police response, use of force, complaints, internal affairs investigations, our citizens advisory group, and we also talk about the great events that we do, some of which you just get a presentation on. And so that I'll jump into the information for the State of the PD. One of the things we're proud of, we're one of about 63 accredited agencies in the state of Washington. And to put this in perspective, there's about 260 police departments and 39 sheriff's departments. And so that's a great accomplishment, especially for an agency of our size. One of the things I think community members and accredited agencies are really concerned about is ensuring that we're not engaged in bias-based policing. And so how do we do that? We do that through a number of ways. We put a number of metrics in place that we monitor throughout the course of the year, and then again at the end of the year when all the data comes through. That is a little challenging for the city of Fife because we have our census population and then we have our actual population. And when you look at our enforcement activity, it complicates it even more because the vast majority of our enforcement activity occurs with non-residents. And so really the demographics is not a great way in of itself for us to determine is there or is there not bias-based policing. So this is just one small piece in that puzzle that we look at across the wide spectrum of everything that we do that we call critical areas of policing to ensure that our officers are not engaging in bias-based policing. And so we do that for use of force, we do that for dispatch calls, self-initiated calls, types of force used, injuries. We also look at our complaint data, and so there's a number of metrics we use to ensure that our officers are not engaged in bias-based policing. And really this slide this is what our census population is. We don't know what the actual population is or what those demographics are. And more importantly, the bulk of our enforcement activity occurs with non-residents. And you'll see last year we went to just over 24,000 calls for service. And so we're fairly busy for a department our size. We also track all of our uses of force. So it could be as simple as an officer pulls his firearm out, has it at what we call the low ready, is giving verbal orders. We track that. We want to make sure that we're tracking every incident in which an officer is using force. And so what you'll see is in 22, our largest use of force was physical controls, which is really the lowest level of force you can use outside of draw and direct. Your physical controls are stuff like your pain compliance techniques, escort holds, and takedowns. Our next is draw and direct, and that is with a firearm. That could be with a less lethal device. But those really comprise, 81% of our overall use of force. And I think really when you look at the total calls for service, we had a large uptick in calls from service from 21 to 22, but we had a fairly significant decrease in the actual use of force and the incident of force, right? So our officers are responding very well to the types of crimes that we're having. And when you see those, we are responding some pretty significantly violent crimes, and our response is still very measured and it's very proportional. And again, out of those 24,000 calls for service, only 96 of those calls resulted in a use of force. Again, use of force, we track a couple of different metrics. We track it by race because we also, again, tie it back to that bias-based policing. We tie it back to mental health. We're all aware that our mental health system is not sufficient to support what we're currently experiencing in our communities. And how you respond now under the law for people experiencing mental illness is kind of controlled by the legislature, police response, and certification boards. And so we want to make sure that we're tracking that. And then again, we want to track by residency just to show in regards to what we're tracking for demographics, why our numbers are, maybe why they are. Again, we have to look at that in the whole scheme of things in regards to demographic data, use of force, traffic tickets, residents versus non-residents, our transient population at our hotels. So we track all that data. We also track mental health and types of force. And so you see the vast majority is not use of force, but when you see physical controls you'll see that's a higher proportion for people with mental illness, and that's because those typically require more hands-on response. They're incoherent, they may be having delusions, and so you have to go hands-on to safely detain them for treatment. And so that really is consistent with our training and our experience in the field. Again, just another indicator that we can check to make sure our officers are responding appropriately. The other thing I'd like to point out that's not in this presentation is that we have a multi-tier review process for any use of force. Anytime an officer does a use of force, they have to write the information in a general report. They fill out a separate electronic use of force form. That's reviewed by their first level supervisor to ensure they've complied with training and policy. It then goes to the operations assistant chief for review for policy and training, and then it goes to the support services assistant chief for review and compliance with policy and training. And at the end of the year, I review all of them. Anytime a use of force review results in questions, they all get pushed up to me for review and a determination on how we're going to respond to a use of force that is either questionable or is unclear, or that could be unconstitutional. And the short answer is if we have those, typically that's an internal affairs investigation. We assign an investigation and we respond appropriately based on the information that we have. And again, as you're aware, the legislature did require police departments now to start reporting to a statewide database. I just got notified today, so they're going to start collecting our data. And I'm proud to say is when the legislature put out the data they wanted tracked, we had to add like 1 or 2 categories. And they tracked a very large amount of information. We already tracked that. So much like the pursuit policy, we almost had very little change with the legislative changes, which means we're probably doing it right to begin with, which is good information. Again, I think this is one of my, I say, prouder moments for a couple of reasons. You know, I think the community and council deserves a high level of transparency and accountability when it comes to police use of force to make sure that we're doing things right. But it is always better to have an outside, unbiased person do a review of your processes to make sure that you're getting them right, or to make sure that, or to provide recommendations. And so I'm proud that we were able to do that, and the information confirmed all the reports I've been doing for years for the council. But it also resulted in us hiring a top-notch officer. So Ryan Flood was our PLU intern, and now he's one of our high-performing police officers on the street. And so the study was several pages long. He and I both did a presentation. I think the key points you want to take away from this is, compared to the national rate, residents of Fife are less likely to experience all types of force. So across all use of force spectrums, our residents are less likely to experience those than anywhere in the nation. Fife PD's rate of applications of force per call for service is much lower than the national rate. Also a great statistic. It's even better when you consider the last one. Fife has a higher rate of calls for service per resident nationally. So if you think about that, we have a much lower rate of using force, but we respond to a lot more calls than the national average. And so those numbers, when you look at this, Fife 1.87, the national average 0.24, yet we're considerably lower in uses of force across all categories. Again, another reason to be very proud of the men and women of our police department. Again, we track types of force, so 24,000 calls for service. 96 of those incidents resulted in use of force, so that's less than 4% calls of service where we're actually using force. Our use of force is also very low level. And the other thing that we track is injuries. And so in 2022, we had 6 officers injured as a result of an application of force. And conversely, we had 3 subjects either complain of pain, had visible injuries, or had to be treated for injuries. So our incident rate of injury is very low, not only for our officers, but for our suspects. And again, one of the things that Officer Gilbert does is he's our master defensive tactics instructor. So we provide, I think, top-notch training to our officers on how to use force properly and how to use reasonable and proportional force in response to the people that we're dealing with in the street. And again, it speaks, I think, to the competency and the professionalism of our officers, especially considering the types of calls that they go to. And again, across all force types, we track whether it was dispatched or it was self-initiated. And so out of the 232 applications of force, and you're going, wait a minute, 96 calls, 108 people, 232, let me put this in perspective. 96 calls resulted in use of force against 108 subjects. Okay, so that means that in those 96 calls, there was more than one or two people that we applied force to. And each officer has to track on the same person. So, for instance, if we have an occupied stolen car with one person in it and 3 officers show up and do draw and direct, that's 3 uses of force. So that's why those numbers don't match up like you would necessarily anticipate. You could also have multiple uses of force against one subject. And so we count all of those, and that's why those numbers don't line up, but they really shouldn't, because that's not how force works. And again, so 203 of those were from dispatch calls for service. The remaining calls were for self-initiated activity, but when you look at that, 19 were drawn direct, again, a low level of force, actually no hands-on. 6 were physical controls, and 2 were display of taser and display of pepper ball. So that was a show of force versus an actual use of force. So really great numbers on how we're responding to things in the field. Again, when you look for our calls for service, these are the Class A crimes we talk about, or what we call our violent crime metrics. You'll see that we were down a little bit in commercial burglaries. Our domestic violence related calls were down fairly significantly. Our motor vehicle theft increased very significantly. But if you recall, that was a trend throughout Washington State. We went from 6th in the nation to 3 or 4 in the nation for stolen vehicles. And we're not even in the top 3 or 4 in regards to population. Our residential burglary stayed about the same, as did our robberies and our shooting victims. I would say we had a very significant increase in shots fired call. And our vehicle recoveries were up, which is a good thing. If we're having a lot of stolen vehicles, we want our recoveries to increase as well. I do think I want to present some data that came from the 43rd annual publication of the Washington Uniform Crime Report, which is put out through WASPIC, which is the Washington Association of Sheriffs and Police Chiefs. In 2022, there was an 8.5% overall increase in property crimes. And in violent crimes, there was an 8.9% increase through the state of Washington. Over that same period, Fife realized a 2.3% decrease in violent crimes. And so not great, but we did better than the rest of the state. And so I'd say that's a move in the positive direction anyways. This one is concerning, and this is the murder rate in Washington State. And when you really look at this, you can look at the trend starting to increase right about COVID, and it's just keep continuing on. And one of the things that the WASPIC is linking to that is officer staffing, and this is officers per 1,000 in population in Washington State. And so the next logical question is, well, where does Fife lie in the mix of officers per 1,000? And so I want to put this in perspective, because I think you need a couple answers. While we are well above the officer per 1,000 calculation, there's a couple of things that make that a metric that's not very reliable in of itself. Yes.
Population, okay. And you'll get to the lower. I just wanted to make sure it wasn't officer per 1,000 crimes, so.
Nope, I'm getting there. So if you look at our numbers, we're double and even higher in regards to officer per population, per the 1,000, and you're thinking, wow, we're doing really good. But there's a couple of things you have to take into consideration. The first is our population is not our actual population. So that number is skewed higher because we don't account for everybody that's in the city that we're interacting with. And so to put that in perspective, if you look at what the crime rate is per the officer per 1,000, we would have to be staffed at 4.03 officers per 1,000 to meet the minimum staffing that Washington State currently experiences. 4.3 is not sustainable for us. I think my position is we are doing really good with staff. Council added 3 positions. But a lot of times people throw this statistic out, and I think it's important to have context. Why does Fife have twice the officer per 1,000 than, say, Tacoma? Well, here's the reason. Our population is not really reflected in our census data, and our crime rate is much different than other cities in the state of Washington. And then, so I'll happily stop here and answer any questions if you have on that slide, if I didn't hit that right. Another concerning trend that WASPIC's noticing, we had a 42% increase in officer assaults from 2018 to 2022. And we continue to see this pretty much weekly in the news. Officers being assaulted, cars being rammed. We just had one head today, almost an officer get out of the way before he got rammed. Stolen vehicle, couldn't chase it. And so we are seeing an increase of violence against uniform officers throughout the state. And then here's what we call our violent crimes, or what we track. And again, this was the 2.3% reduction overall. And again, you got to look at the numbers, because you're like, oh, we had a 100% reduction. Well, we went from 1 to 0, right? So overall, when you look at that, that's the 2.3 reduction. And all reported crimes year over year through NIBRS, which is our National Incidence-Based Reporting System, which all departments are supposed to use now. They got rid of the UCR, and they're all NIBRS now. But not all departments actually report to NIBRS. So the annual report that you get from WASPIC that comes out that we use has all the agencies that report within the county and the state. And then some of the other information we track, obviously traffic enforcement has gone way down. It started in 2016 when we had to remove our traffic unit to respond to 911 calls. Then we restricted discretionary traffic enforcement through the pandemic. And then we had all the legislative changes in regards to police response. And now there's still conversations about actually removing traffic stop authority for police officers. And so that's one just going to have to keep an eye on. But when we look at crimes or weapons used in types of crimes, the number one weapon is personal weapons, and then no weapons, and then firearms is the next highest. And so that's what we're seeing in Fife with our reported crimes. We see relationship victim to offender. And then when you look at property value by type, that really talks about what we're dealing with in regards to destroyed or damaged property, recovered property, and property that's stolen.
Can you elaborate on personal weapons?
Personal weapons, fists, knees, elbows, head. Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Pursuits is an area, again, that gets a lot of attention in this state. As you recall, when I got here, I implemented a very restrictive pursuit policy. When the legislature changed the pursuit law, we really didn't have to change much except for remove a couple of crimes. I think our community is very unique in that we have a great deal of semi-traffic. We have a great deal of vehicle traffic and large amounts of pedestrian traffic. And so from my perspective, having Fife officers engage in pursuits for low-level crimes and property crimes is not a good fit for our community. That's not the same for like Pierce County unincorporated at 2 in the morning, right? That really should be, I think, local controlled decisions. But from my perspective, Fife is not a great city to be chasing people for low-level crimes, even low-level felony crimes. And so we continue to have a more restrictive pursuit policy than current state law requires. If you recall, this year they changed the standard to reasonable suspicion. We kept the probable cause standard, and we do not allow pursuits for DUI, and we do not allow pursuits for domestic violence, 4th-degree assault, because that's a misdemeanor assault. So we are more restricted than the state, but I think that's in our best interest. And so with that, anytime an officer engages in a pursuit, they're required to fill out a separate report. We track that. We do report that to the National Pursuit Database. And so in 2022, we had 2 pursuits. One was canceled by the officer, and the other one was canceled by a supervisor. And so in 2022, only 2 pursuits, both complied with policy, and we did what we were supposed to do in regards to termination. Complaints. Again, we rose by almost 350, 3,050 calls for service, yet our complaints actually went down and the number of sustained complaints actually went down, which is a good trend. And I think a couple of things play into that. One, I think it's the training we provide. I think it's the level of accountability and transparency we have. And body-worn cameras has really helped that out. When you look at the not sustained numbers versus so not sustained, that when you get a not sustained finding, there's not enough information to prove or disprove. So a citizen calls in, makes a complaint. It's a he said, she said. There's not enough to say one way or the other. It no longer exists. We have body-worn camera. So unless it wasn't recorded, we have a definitive finding on all complaints that we have now, which is a great thing. And not surprisingly, at least for police administrators, what we find is that the complaints that we get are unfounded and a lot of times fabricated to the point where you're like, I don't even know how you do this. You should be charged with filing a false report. So those body-worn cameras are just a great tool I think they keep our officers safe. It keeps us accountable, but it allows us to show the interactions we're having in a good way. And it has had a positive effect on our complaints. And so when you look at that, complaints for calls for service, I can't even give you your percent on that. It's very, 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 very low. And sustained complaints for 22, again, very low. And then internal affairs investigations. So this is how we separate out. A complaint really is some type of alleged misconduct that would result in discipline that's lower than a letter of reprimand. And that's typically your coach counseling. So a first-time rudeness complaint, a first-time driving complaint, that's something that's going to be handled at the first level supervisor level and our patrol assistant chief. Anything that's going to result in a letter of reprimand or higher automatically gets signed to an internal affairs investigation. That goes through my office. We assign an investigator. And then with consultation with HR and the city manager, I make recommendations for discipline. And that can be anything from a letter of reprimand to termination. And again, we only had 2 internal affairs investigations last year. They were both sustained, but they were very low level. And so I think one of the other things I'd like to point out is most departments have a interesting relationship with their bargaining units in regards to discipline. We've had over 43 investigations since I've been the chief, and not one single one has resulted in a grievance or an arbitration. And many times our guild and our subjects, our employees, engage in what we call stipulated findings. And so we just say, here's what you did, here's what we're proposing for discipline. The guild and the employees sign off on it, and we never hear about it again. And that is very, very rare for police departments. When you talk to labor attorneys, they just scratch their head, how did you get here? But a very effective tool for us, and it saves us a lot of issues with morale. It saves us employee time, not only from the guild representing them at a ladder mill hearing or potential arbitration. It also saves staff time in regards to preparing for arbitrations, ladder mills, and it keeps us from maybe hiring outside legal experts to defend us in an arbitration or a grievance hearing. So I think that speaks volume about the processes that we have in place, but also the caliber of people that we have in our police department. Chat with the Chief is, matter of fact, we're filming Thursday. For 22, we did a number of topics on Chat with the Chief, our virtual reality training simulator, our homelessness response on DOT property. We covered the legislative changes in 2022, our trespass program, hiring process, use of force, state of the PD, and our Special Olympics and Fife PD overall. And we just have some great topics. Our August topic was back to school safety. And so we're trying to time our episodes with, I think, time sensitive and time appropriate messages to our community. And one of them is actually going to be the state of the PD. So this presentation will be used for our community as we talk about what we're doing in the community in regards to the state of the PD. 3 programs which I really like and I think have served well for the police department is our business block watch program. We had it started and then COVID hit and then we lost our police specialist. Danny has been a phenomenal hire. She has reinvigorated that program. We have a great deal of investment and commitment from our business owners. And as you recall from our presentation, cities split up into 6 sections, and she meets with them regularly to give crime prevention tips, crime tips, other tips, and it's just a way to communicate with our businesses on how we can improve our response and our relationship to help combat crime. The other thing I think I'm really proud of is standing up our Citizens Advisory Group. I think one of the things that we're all aware of is that the communication between the police department and the community as a whole, and really maybe underrepresented portions of the community, is very low. And so how do we leverage our communication skills, our relationship building skills to improve that? And how do we build trust within our community? Well, you do that by building friendships and being transparent with what you're doing. And so in 2020, partnered with Pastor Michael Wilkins, and we put together our Citizens Advisory Group. We do meet weekly. We meet monthly. They get the monthly PD update after you do. And then a lot of the time is spent answering questions about, we saw this headline in Chicago, we saw this headline in Seattle. How would Fife PD respond? What's your policy on this? So really it is an outside way to measure and gauge what we're doing and to take input from our community members on how we can improve, or if they don't understand why or how a police department responded to an incident. And one of our members is actually our independent investigation team civilian member. So anytime we have an officer-involved shooting, that person gets called to make sure they go through the conflict of interest statements and to authorize any use of department equipment through an investigation. And so that's just another way to have, I think, additional transparency and accountability with our community. And then lastly, our strategic planning committee, I stood that up in 2016 when I first got here. We wanted to take a look at our mission, vision, our values. We update that every year. So our strategic planning committee meets 4 times a year. At the beginning of the year, at the end of the year, I provide them a report card. This is what you told me you wanted us to accomplish. Here's what we accomplished. And then they set the goals for the coming year. And we go over those and keep a report card that we report out quarterly when we meet with this group. And the strategic planning committee group has representation from command staff, police sergeants, commissioned police officers, our non-commissioned guild, and members of our community. And so again, they look at our mission, vision, our values. They look at what they want to see the police department work on or accomplish in the coming year. And then we're responsive to that group and how we do in regards to a report card. So to give you an example, some of the things they put out and some of the areas that we're looking at is department development, maintain ongoing valid current entry and lateral lists. HR has done a lot of work to make sure that we have ongoing lists so that we can fill our open positions. We still currently have 3 open positions, but we have a continuous list that we can pull from, and we'll be doing oral boards here in the coming weeks. One of the things that always caught us up is that our sergeant's list is good for a year, and then we can extend it, but you have to pay for those testing processes. Well, the sergeant leaves, then we have no one going, and it takes several months to do a vetted assessment center, and so they want us to maintain a promotional list, which I think is good money for us. And so we've done that since I've been here. And they do want us to increase our recruitment efforts, and we've been far more engaged in job fairs at Fort Lewis and at colleges, and that's actually worked out well for us as far as getting interested candidates. This is a bad color, and I gotta look sideways. Actively foster positive community relations. And here's their recommendations. This is not from the PD. Maintain our monthly citizens advisory group meetings, reestablish the business block watch, expand the block watch to neighborhoods, which Danny is currently doing, continue to promote chat with the chief, educate citizens on policy and legislative changes, maintain the monthly PD update. That you have to listen to that every month, but there's a lot of interest in that group that continues. And again, annual report to the website and post on the website, and of course the state of the PD presentation goes to that because I do that for you first, then I do that to our Citizens Advisory Group, and then I also do it for the Chamber of Commerce. And so we're getting that information out to our community in a number of ways. Commit to progressive policies and training, prepare for future opportunities, identify and train 4 regional patrol tactics instructors. So part of the legislative changes was this 40-hour training scheme that officers are going to be required to go to. All commissioned officers will have to complete this by 2028, and part of that is a 24-hour patrol tactics in-service class. And so the state needs to build a cadre of instructors that can regionally teach. We currently have 2. Obviously, as you can imagine, you need people to volunteer to go do that because it's a lot of training. They have to get certified in it, and they have to have a desire to do that. So currently, our patrol tactics in-service instructors are Pat Gilbert and Officer Pat Donovan. And so we're looking at trying to get 2 more next year, and we're going to work to make sure that we meet that deadline way before 2028. And as an example, our command staff, all of us have been through that, and we're rotating a fixed number of officers through every year to make sure that can be well ahead of the 2028 deadline for all officers meeting those core requirements. Currently, everyone who's going to the academy gets that there. And here's the part that the legislature, I didn't think, thought out very well. But once you attend that PTI class, that resets every 3 years. And you have to go through that every 3 years with the additional 24 hours on top of that. And so when you look at all the training, I'd call that an unfunded mandate that we are working really hard to make, but it is a stretch. And so it'd be nice to see them address that with some type of support. And last is grants, and I'll have to tell you, we look at grants, but there's a couple of things that stop us from actually pursuing a lot of grants. The first is capacity. As you can imagine, we got a lot going on, and having someone having the time to write, manage, and report on a grant is very time consuming. And really, that would probably have to be a member of command staff, and we just don't have capacity. And the second reason, other than equipment grants, a lot of them have matching requirements, and so where does that money come from? And so we do look out for grants, and if there's something there we think we can tackle, we may, but at this point, that's getting little to no attention from us other than looking at what people send us. So that is an area of improvement that we need from our strategic planning standpoint. Again, we talk about all the good work that our officers do. Our Thanksgiving Day meal deliveries. This year, 2022, we made over 300 plates that got delivered. Fife delivered 200, and the rest went to Milton, Sumner, Puyallup PD. As you can imagine, a lot of those went out to the homeless camps or people that living on the street. And Too Busy to Cook just does a phenomenal job. They dedicate their staff for prep, cooking, and boxing up the meals so that we can deliver that. And then all the employees and city council members donate their time to go out and deliver the meals. And so, again, one of these things where it's humbling to go to someone's house and know they don't have food for a holiday, let alone through the course of the week. And so I think that really puts people's humanity in perspective, which is a good thing for police, because a lot of times we're seeing the bad side of that, and that helps us put this in perspective, and that we're actually getting a chance to help people. And so I really want to look at thanking the major donors, System for Public Safety, which is the company that builds the patrol cars, Too Busy to Cook, Costco Business Center employees, because they get a turkey every year from Costco and they donate those to us so we can make the meals out of those. And then, I'm going to mess this up, Macarena Bakery. They all support our Thanksgiving Day meal delivery, and we couldn't do that without our sponsors. So just a great program. Again, Shop with the Cop. I really got to give Tony credit, because we hired Tony. He was still on probation. He came to my office and said, "Chief, I have an idea. I want to do this." Okay, run with it. And so Alexis of Tacoma from the O'Brien Group always donates a couple of cars with magnetic identifiers on them so we can provide escorts. GLM Charters donates a bus and a driver for the entire day that we can take the kids and the families up to Bonnie Lake and shop in the Walmart. The Walmart actually sets aside a cashier and a lane that only we can go through. And again, Parks, they loaned us the community center so we could have a pizza party when we came back. This year, the kids got a $150 gift card to buy $150 to buy anything they wanted. And I think Councilmember Halsey talked about this, is you're talking about young kids who are trying to buy clothes for their siblings. That's the way they're living. And so, great program. And then each of the parents got an extra $100 for food. So, huge program. It's a lot of fun if you get a chance to go out there. I would recommend it. And that completes my report. So I will be happy to answer any questions that you have. Now I'm going to be accused of taking 2 hours at a council meeting.
Yeah, you're done.
Well, if the shoe fits, then it's all been great information. I appreciate all the information, and you need like a big, tall glass of water. And a chair. All right, I'm going to open it up for questions or comments. Councilmember Halsey.
Yeah, thanks, Chief. I mean, I've showed this stuff to other people that live in other jurisdictions, and they just are astonished, especially when you go to 24,050 calls. They almost fall off their chair for our little city. But there's a lot of good information in there, and it shows how good our police force is and all the things that we do right. I don't know how much of this you've given to the legislators, but there's a lot of little nuggets in there that would be really good to get to them to show what we're doing right and what we've been doing right. And the grant thing, there's a lot of work into that. And I think you're on the right track as far as picking and choosing what you want to go after, because it takes a lot of time to put all that stuff together. So on top of everything else that's going on. I'm glad that we have 2 training officers. I knew that Pat did defensive tactics, but I didn't know Pat Donovan was, so that's a good thing. And probably my biggest concern is the hiring, because you and I both know that we've got a lot of guys over there that could go tomorrow. And that was one of the first things I talked to Derek when he hired was, the succession planning is really important, and we're in a rough time as far as hiring goes and stuff like that. So that's probably the one thing and I mean, you guys are doing everything you can, but I mean, that's the one thing that kind of scares me, is that we're going to lose some of those guys, and then hopefully not a bunch at once. So that's kind of the unknown out of everything else. But this is always really a good thing to have, at the end of the year, and the good stats and things like that. And I know there's a lot of work that went into this too, and I have a sneaking suspicion that Kerry had something to do with this.
Everything to do with it.
But it's really done well, and it's easy to understand, and that's what's really important. If you show it to somebody that's a resident or something, and they read through it, it's not really confusing and stuff like that. So that's a big plus too. So thank you very much for doing that.
Yeah, in regards to succession planning, the city manager and I meet regularly to talk about what staffing looks like. We are hampered. Put this in perspective, currently we have 31 positions filled. We have 3 more to go. But before you added those 3 overhires, we would be fully full right now. We do have 2 in the academy that are graduating October 9th. We hired our latest officer beginning of August, and he got a February academy date. Happy to report he just got bumped up to the November academy date, and now he's on standby for the October academy date. And so that's good news as well. We did go through our list, and that's expired, and so Sarah is working with our assistant chief to set up another round of oral boards. And succession planning is one of my to-do lists from our city manager, not only from the perspective of when I retire, but the other 2 assistant chiefs. And we know, forecasting from age alone, over the next 5 years, we have 15 officers that can retire. And so we are trying to plan ahead to make sure that we don't find ourselves in a staffing shortage. So hopefully that makes you feel a little bit better that we are on top of it. Derek and I talk pretty regularly about attrition. How do we account for that, and how do we make sure that we're safe? And there's a number of things that we're doing that we'll probably talk about later in the year or next year in regards to our staffing and how we come out of that pretty solidly moving forward.
Councilmember Yambe.
So, Chief, I know what you're going to say in response to this, so I want to premise it by saying, first of all, I recognize, and we all recognize it's a group effort, it's a team effort, and that, what one person is doing is trying to lift all boats. So I wanted to start there. But I do want to give you a compliment in that I do believe that the chief sets the tone. And I do believe that it also helps that you have a cooperative department who also can see that vision. But, since 10 years ago, I think this department has only improved every year. And I don't think that we've ever been as ahead now, not just catching up, but ahead of transparency, accountability measures. Like you pointed out, that we've already been doing a lot of things that the state has implemented across the state, and shows that our teams are innovative, and we're thinking about the next step, and we're thinking about ahead. And so we're not reacting to things, we're just slowly adjusting here and there, minor adjustments to make sure that we're up with all the things. So kudos to you, and kudos to your officers and department, because I think, and being aware of, you guys keeping succession planning and ahead, I mean, it's also important that the people coming up have models of what thoughtful, future planning, police look like. And so we're very fortunate that you and your staff have such great examples, and that people who are coming up can see that live and see how it works in the real world. So I really appreciate that, and I appreciate these presentations that keep getting more accessible and easy for us to show anybody, any resident, like, Councilmember Halsey said. I mean, I've shown this a couple places, and they're like, oh, this is really easy to access. There's, they don't have as many questions as, some, it's so wordy and jargon, and this makes it very easy to understand. So thanks a lot for doing that, and keep up the good work.
Thank you. And like you said, you knew, I have to give a lot of credit to our staff. We just have amazing people from the council on down. So thank you for the opportunity to work here and represent you as your chief.
Thank you for joining me on today's episode. You can access our annual report on our website.